The Bones of the Earth is a short story contained in Ursula K. Leguin's fifth Earthsea book, Tales from Earthsea. And it is indeed a tale about a character at first called Silence and his old teacher and mentor, Dulse. It's going to turn out that Silence is in fact Ogion the Silent, the mage who originally took Ged in, taught him, sent him off to Roke, welcomed him back. There's a lot more backstory there as well in the earlier Earthsea novels. But now we're getting to learn about Ogion himself and his teacher and the teacher of his teacher, as well as a little bit about a character who appears very early on in Wizard of Earthsea and who dies as a result of Ged's foolishness, and that is the Archmage Nemerle. This is before he is indeed the Archmage that a lot of the things are taking place. And so we have this character, Dulse. We find out his true name early on in a kind of unusual way, Heleth. And he is the Wizard of Re Albi before Ogion will be the Wizard of Re Albi. And he's kind of in many respects, an ordinary guy, although he is also a man of power. He studies first on Gont with the wizard Ard, who we're going to find out a little bit later is actually a woman, very unusual, in that she's not a witch, but rather an actual wizard, and there's a lot going on there to talk about. Then he goes to Roke and studies in particular with Nemerle, when Nemerle is the patterner who lives in the Imminent Grove, right? Before Nemerle will become the Archmage, who is the one when Ged goes there. And then he comes back to Gont, and he lives a rather simple life. We find him at the very beginning talking about the wooden floor that Silence or Ogion has put in place. He's not very happy about it, although he is also happy that his pupil did all that work for him. He walks around barefoot. Why does he walk around barefoot? Because that's a way that he can connect with the earth. And so we see this interesting little vignette at the beginning. When he was a child, he'd like to walk in mud. He remembered enjoying the cool of it rising between his toes. He still liked to go barefoot, but no longer enjoyed mud. It was a sticky stuff, and he disliked stooping to clean his feet before going into the house. When he'd had a dirt floor, it hadn't mattered, but now he had a wooden floor, like a lord or a merchant or an archmage, to keep the cold and damp out of his bones. Not his own notion. Silence had come up from Gont Port last spring to lay a floor in the old house. They'd had one of their arguments about it. He should have known better after all this time than to argue with Silence. And then he begins thinking about his time with Silence. And again, great storytelling here. He turned up on Dulce's doorstep a few years ago. Well, no, 20 years ago it must be, or 25, a while now. He'd been truly a boy then, long-legged, rough-haired, soft-faced, a set mouth, clear eyes. And so this is, going back quite a way. He's remembering when Ogion first came to study, or Ogion doesn't even say to study, he just says to learn with Dulce. And it's very interesting how he winds up getting his name. What we learn a little bit later from Dulce inquiring about it is that Silence was a town boy born in Gont Port. He'd said nothing about himself, but Dulce had asked around a bit. His father, a longshoreman, had died in the big earthquake when Silence would have been 7 or 8. The mother was a cook at a waterfront inn. At 12, the boy had gotten into some kind of trouble, probably messing about with magic, and the mother had managed to apprentice him to Alasan, a respectable sorcerer in Valmuth. There the boy had picked up his true name and some skill in carpentry and farm work, if not much else. And Alasan had had the generosity after 3 years to pay his passage to Roke. That was all that Dulce knew about him. And Silence isn't really saying anything more. So we've got this backstory. we find out that Silence has already been to Roke, because Dulse is going to suggest to him, well, here we go. Here's the story. Dulce knew what he wanted, what they all wanted, keeping his eyes from those clear eyes. He was a good teacher, the best on Gont, he knew that. But he was tired of teaching. He didn't want another apprentice underfoot, and he sensed danger. Right? So sometimes the reward for being good at what you do is people give you more and more of it, even if you don't want it. And Dulce turns out to be, quite a good teacher. In fact, he's had good teachers himself. So Ogion, or Silence, has come to him, and he says, I want to learn. And Dulce says, well, go to Roke. He says, you can afford passage. And then he says, I've been there. Dulce looks him over again. No cloak, no staff. Why does that matter? Well, if he had a staff, that would be because he was, in fact, a mage and had completed his training and would be sent out. So he asks, failed? Sent away? Run away? The boy shook his head at each question. He shut his eyes. His mouth was already shut. He stood there intensely gathered, suffering, drew breath, looked straight into the wizard's eyes. So he's not answering the questions other than to say, no, no, no. And then here's what he says. My mastery is here on Gont. My master is Heleth. I said that we learn Heleth, or Dulce's true name. Ogion has his true name. He probably shouldn't, but he does. How did he get it? How did he arrive at it? Perhaps Nemmerle told him. We don't actually find out, do we? But he says his mastery is at Roke. His finishing as a wizard is not, or is a Gont, rather. His mastery is not in Roke. Roke can teach him a lot, but there's something more that can be taught to him from Gontish magic. In silence, Dulce sought the boy's name and saw two things, a fur cone and the rune of the closed mouth. Then, seeking further, he heard in his mind a name spoken but did not speak it. And then he says to the young boy, I'm tired of teaching and talking. I need silence. Is that enough for you? The boy nodded once. Then to me you are silence. You can sleep in the nook, and he begins teaching him. So we have silence in a couple different ways. The young boy is being named Silence. Later on, he will be the silent one. He's also expected to work in silence as much as possible. Not total silence, of course, because teaching cannot take place without there being some articulation. But the silence allows them to punctuate with words, this vast background, you might say. And so Dulce teaches silence. And there's a really interesting phrase here that prefigures what's going to happen later on in the story. He's going to teach him mastery, teaching the high arts, teaching spells, things like that, but also what went deeper than mastery. And that's a good thing for us to think about. What does go deeper than mastery, turns it into mere mastery? That perhaps is something Dulce could teach him, what he had learned here on Gont before he ever went to Roke, what he had learned from his own teacher, Ard, and what he had learned in the process afterwards as well. And here then we get some really interesting ruminations by Dulce about fathers and sons. He says, Dulce thought sometimes in those years about sons and fathers. He had quarreled with his own father, a sorcerer, a prospector, over his own choice of Ard as his teacher. His father had shouted that a student of Ard's was no son of his, and nursed his rage, died unforgiving. So, we know that there's some bad blood, perhaps professional jealousy between his father and Ard. As it's going to turn out later, it has to do with the fact that Ard is actually a sorceress, right? A wizard. And so she doesn't have a staff, by the way, either, because of course she didn't go to Gont. She did study with a mage herself, as we find out. Dulce had seen young men weep for joy at the birth of a first son. He'd seen poor men pay witches a year's earnings for the promise of a healthy boy, and a rich man touch his gold bedizened baby's face and whisper adoringly, "My immortality." Now, this is worth hesitating on for a moment. It's often the case that parents project into their children something that doesn't need to be there, their own immortality, their own legacy, and that's not quite allowing the child to be what they're going to be. He'd also, he says, seen men beat their sons, bully and humiliate them, spite and thwart them, hating the death they saw in them. He'd seen the answering hatred in the son's eyes, the threat, the pitiless contempt. And seeing it, Dulce knew why he'd never sought reconciliation with his father. So this is another model of fathers and sons, a kind of rivalry between the two of them, a hatred that continues. And then there's a third possibility. He had seen a father and son work together from daybreak to sundown, the old man guiding a blind ox, the middle-aged man driving the iron-bladed plow, never a word spoken. And as they started home, the old man lay his hand a moment on the son's shoulder, a gesture of love and companionship. He'd always remembered that. He remembered it now when he looked across the hearth, winter evenings, at the dark face bent above a lore book or a shirt that needed mending, the eyes cast down, the mouth closed, the spirit listening. And this is his silence. He sees him as something like his son. This will come up again very explicitly in another passage. And then he tells Silence about Nemerle, the man who sent Silence to him. He says, once in his lifetime, if he's lucky, a wizard finds someone he can talk to. Nemerle had said that to Dulce a night or two before Dulce left Roke, a year or two before Nemerle was chosen archmage. If you stayed Heleth, we could talk. Dulce had been unable to answer at all for a while, then stammering, guilty at his ingratitude and incredulous at his obstinacy. Master, I would stay, but my work is on Gont. I wish it was here with you. And Nemerle says to him, it's a rare gift to know where you need to be before you've been to all the places you don't need to be. Well, send me a student now and then. Roke needs Gontish wizardry. I think we're leaving things out here, things worth knowing. Something very worthy of a patterner in Earthsea saying, the ones who look to the pattern itself. And we find that he tells Silence about this. He asks, why didn't you come to me first and then go to Roke to put a polish on it? And Silence says, I didn't want to waste your time. And he asked, did Nemerle know you were coming to work with me? Silence shook his head. If you deigned to tell him your intentions, he might have sent a message to me. Silence looked stricken. Was he your friend? Dulce paused. He was my master. Would have been my friend, perhaps, if I'd stayed on Roke. Have wizards friends? No more than they have wives or sons, I suppose. Once he said to me that in our trade it's a lucky man who finds someone to talk to. Keep that in mind. If you're lucky one day, you'll have to open your mouth. Silence bowed his rough, thoughtful head. If it hasn't rusted shut, Dulce added. If you ask me to, I'll talk, the young man said, so earnest, so willing to deny his whole nature at Dulce's request that the wizard had to laugh. And so there's this exchange, and it's, like a fatherly son exchange, even though it's being denied in the very process. And then what we find is that Dulce has the big lore book open on the table. He had been trying to reweave one of the Acostan spells, much broken and made powerless centuries ago. He had just begun to get a sense of the missing word that might fill one of the gaps. He almost had it, and then Silence breaks his silence. You might keep some goats. And they have a discussion about goats and things like that. And then they work together on the spell again. So here's the reference. After spending the next several days trying to capture the missing word, he had set Silence to studying the Acostan spells. Together, they finally worked it out. A long toil. Like plowing with a blind ox, Dulce said. Going back to this passage, he had seen the Father and son work together from daybreak to sundown, the old man guiding a blind ox, the middle-aged man driving the iron-bladed plow. That is them in this image. Not long after that, he gave Silence the staff he had made for him of Gontish oak, and the Lord of Gauntport had tried once again to get Dulce to come down to do what needed doing in Gauntport, and Dulce had sent Silence down instead, and there he had stayed. His apprenticeship is finished. He has learned what he needed to learn from Dulce, according to Dulce, and now has his staff. He has finished his education, nearly, at least the education he's receiving from other wizards, including Dulce, and through Dulce from Ard.